So the first film that we'll watch this semester is Nosferatu. It is a very famous silent film from 1922. It is a German film. It was originally not in English, so you'll see some of that in this poster here, but you will also notice that the subtitles and the cards are in English, and that's because this is an English adaptation of the German film Nosferatu. Nosferatu is part of the era of silent films, which began film history. Nosferatu is one of the more famous silent films in the category of The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, Battleship Potemkin, Metropolis, and Charlie Chaplin's City Lights. These are some of the most famous silent films of their time. Most films these days have sound. In 2011, there was a very well-known film called The Artist. It was incredibly successful. It won 5 Academy Awards. We call those Oscars. It won Best Picture, Best Actor, Best Director, Best Costume Design, and Best Score, which means Best Music. Another kind of famous award that movies can get are called Golden Globes. Now, The Artist also received 5 other Oscar nominations for which it didn't win, but it did win 3 other Golden Globe Awards and was nominated for 3 additional Golden Globes for which it didn't win. Some people really like The Artist. Some people are still thrown by the silent movie, which you don't see very much of these days, if anything at all. For fans of comedy, you shouldn't confuse The Artist with a slightly raunchy stand-up from a comedian named Brian Posehn. His stand-up special was called The Fartist. And it looks a lot like The Artist, so it could easily be confused. It was actually, I enjoyed it. It was pretty funny, but I happen to like that kind of humor. Prince talks about Nosferatu specifically in our textbook, and he talks about it in chapters 4, 7, 9, and 10. And what you really need to understand about Nosferatu is that Prince and many other film scholars put Nosferatu squarely in a German expressionist film. And expressionist film is a pretty unique kind of film that we will see elements of in some of our later films, but ultimately expressionism is opposed to realism. So if realism is about making films look as real as possible, expressionism is the opposite of that. It emphasizes elaborate distortions. Things are very oddly shaped in expressionism. You often see shadows and violent visual contrasts. The architecture in expressionism, which is very obvious in Nosferatu, is kind of weirdly shaped. There are odd camera angles, which we'll see some of in this film and in later films. And there are elements that integrate what the actor looks like with the architecture that's around him, and I'll show you an example of that in a moment. Prince also talks about the silent film era, and he does that in chapter 6. Silent films, what's interesting about silent films, and you can see a little bit of that in Nosferatu, is there's a very powerful musical score, obviously not music that had words, but very orchestral, and the music in silent films is meant to convey meaning. Often they used music that was in the public domain, classical music that they wouldn't have to pay a copyright for. Sometimes they used popular tunes of the era. This is very different than movies today, where movies and soundtracks are very closely tied together, even when the songs don't actually appear in the films. And you can actually go online and look at some of the more famous movie soundtracks and find songs that don't actually appear in the narrative of the film. Sometimes they appear in the credits. Sometimes they don't appear at all, but they're associated with the film, and that's why they're on the soundtrack. Rolling Stone had a really interesting list of the 25 greatest soundtracks of all time. Some of those are not really that surprising. Pulp Fiction, Singles, Boogie Nights, Goodfellas, Pretty in Pink, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? These are great movies with great soundtracks. Nosferatu didn't quite make the list. So in the article that we read by Hensley, it's important to know that what sets Nosferatu apart from other Dracula narratives is that there's a romance narrative in it. We will start to see elements of that in some of our later films. Ellen becomes a willing victim in this film, and that's really important to keep in mind. There's the suggestion that Count Dracula is attracted to a mortal woman. We'll see elements of that later. There were some interesting legal battles that Hensley points out But what's most interesting is that there's this mythology about Nosferatu that they had to call it Nosferatu because they were worried about getting sued by Bram Stoker and they couldn't call it Dracula, and they changed the story in all these ways to make it different than Dracula. And that was done because we saw that, but ultimately that was just artistic embellishment and had nothing to do with lawsuits or copyrights. Dracula was in the public domain because Bram Stoker never applied for a copyright. What you also notice about Dracula that Hensley points out is that the makeup, the lighting, and the set really were intended to make the vampire seem more horrible. And you can see that throughout the film. I mean, this is a pretty horrible vampire. This isn't someone you'd want to be hanging around with, unlike some of our later vampires. If you look at some of these screenshots, you'll see that these are the ways in which the expressionist film technique was deployed. So in the shot of him in the door frame, you can see that he fills the door frame as if they were the same shape. In the shot below, you can see that his body is almost kind of misshapen and warped, and the shadow behind him almost looks like a whole nother person. This is all intentional. This is all part of expressionist filmmaking, where it's meant to convey a kind of unreality as opposed to the reality of realism film. You can see in this shot, and it's a little blurry because the actual shot in the film is a little blurry, but he doesn't look like what we think about when we envision vampires. He's not dressed like a count. He doesn't look like someone who's wealthy or has a lot of power. He almost looks like someone that's a little weak and not all that strong. You'll notice in this particular screenshot it's blue, and you'll see that in some of our other screenshots, and you'll have seen that throughout the film. And ultimately, that was used to convey night. In these films, you couldn't really shoot at night because it was too hard to do, so they shot everything during the day pretty much, and the shots that were meant to be at night were tinted blue to make it seem like a different color at a different time of day. So these are some of the more famous shots from Nosferatu. So you see him rising up on the ship out of his coffin. You see the negotiation of the sail. And keep in mind, some of these shots, they will be important in some of our later films. Here you see just a kind of iconic Dracula in the coffin, even though he's Nosferatu, but the kind of Dracula in the coffin shot, which we will see a lot of throughout this semester. And then this is him coming up out of the boat after he's already killed everyone. Which again is a pretty famous shot from this film. What's interesting to note is that the vampire, and in this film, the vampire stands in for disease, and that disease happens to be the plague. But some of our later vampires will also stand in for disease, and they will stand in for different types of disease. What's interesting about vampires is that you can't really tell who's a vampire and who's not. Now, there are some pretty obvious signs when someone becomes a vampire, right? Their teeth become fangs, and they get really pale, and they like to drink blood. But ultimately, what's most compelling about the vampire is that the vampire can really fit into society. And we'll definitely see that in our later films, where vampires just kind of blend in. And that's kind of the disease of the vampire. When we see some of our later diseases, and we'll talk about those are again diseases where you could openly blend into society. Now, the plague was an interesting example because you could have the plague for a while before you ended up killing everyone around you, and that was part of the fear of the plague, that it was contagious and that everyone had it. There's even this screenshot that says that fear lurked in every corner of town because they couldn't figure out who was healthy and who was sick. And keep that in mind, definitely, for some of our later vampire films, because that is a recurring theme that we will see again and again. You may have noticed that Nosferatu was structured like a play. Many silent films were, but they used the act structure like a play. They actually called it out in the film, Act 1, Act 2. We don't see as much of that anymore, but if you're a fan of someone like Kevin Smith or Quentin Tarantino, they often do divide their films into acts, and they call them something other than an act, but they do call them out with those same sorts of cards. Both Kevin Smith and Quentin Tarantino like to use, funny, quirky language to call out their acts, but ultimately, they're doing the same thing that was done in Nosferatu. They're just doing it a little bit differently. But for Nosferatu, really what sets it apart is its final act, the end of the film. So, in Nosferatu's final act, we see Ellen reluctantly sacrifices herself, and that is outside of the norm of many vampire narratives. Most of the time in a vampire narrative, the men go out and they kill the vampire. That's what they do. But in this film, the men don't do that. Ellen has to give herself to the vampire in order for the vampire to be destroyed. And ultimately, in this film, the power is given to a woman, which again in mainstream Hollywood film and certainly in the films of the 1920s is not the norm. And it's also not the norm in many vampire narratives. And this scene, this particular card calls it out that only she can uh, bring down the vampire, and that's somewhat unique. Some of the key takeaways of Nosferatu is that Nosferatu was a key part of the silent film era. Nosferatu is an example of German expressionist filmmaking. Nosferatu is one of the first, if not the very first, visual representation of a vampire. Before that, it was pretty much just literature. Although different from Dracula, parts of Nosferatu will inspire future vampire films in the same way that Dracula inspires future